From our palatial recording studios high atop our mountain lair on a remote volcanic island, this is Talk Universe, and I'm your host, Sir Charles Schultz.
And I am Eliza, your co-host. Hello and welcome to Talk Universe. And this is our show for Wednesday, March 15th, 2017. Tonight's topic is energy storage systems.
Well, Eliza, it's good to hear you operating again. And how are you feeling? You happy about tonight's show?
Yes, I am.
Great. What can you tell me about what happened last week?
I do not know anything relating to this.
You don't have any issues with what happened?
I do not have any information about this event, sir.
Okay, fine. Well, we're going to continue with the show, and it's going to be a great show, of course. Energy storage systems is a subject that a lot of people are interested in, and we've got a number of user questions and comments tonight. And we also have our other co-host, Ed Minchow, in studio on the island of Montserrat here, and we're going to have him on talking about our Singularity Watch and other technical items and different energy storage technologies. So it's going to be a lot of fun. We'll have 3 participants in the show tonight. This will be a first. So the topic is energy storage systems. Eliza, what can you tell us about storing energy? What types of energy can we store?
There are many types of energy, including mechanical, chemical, potential, kinetic, and electrical.
That's good. That's true. There are many different types of energy, and different storage systems are used for each type. We're going to concentrate on energy storage, particularly for the use in alternative energy systems and off-grid systems, because there's a great deal of interest in that. But we're also going to look at some of the others as well. Now, when we think of energy storage systems, a lot of times we think about batteries, because electrical energy is probably one of the most pervasive forms of energy in our lives. So batteries make a lot of sense. But we have derivatives of that, such as supercapacitors and other things that store electrical energy as well. Batteries are based on chemistry, and capacitors are based on electrostatics, charge, not chemistry. There also are ways of storing energy in the form of mechanical energy. The rubber band, believe it or not, was one of the most effective and dense energy storage methods for many, many years. Think about those wind-up airplanes with a little propeller and the long rubber band, and how far they could go on a few seconds of winding. And, oddly enough, rubber bands, twisted rope, that sort of thing, were the energy storage behind many of the ballistic weapons, the trebuchets, and other devices from many years ago. So there is a long and venerable history of storing mechanical energy. Springs can do that. Every clock that you wind up had a spring in it, and that was storing the energy of the winding to operate the clock for hours or days. A lot of times a weight hanging on a rope was used to power a clock or a clockwork mechanism. We don't think about it, but energy is stored as water uphill behind a dam, and as it runs down, it's converted into electrical energy. So there are energy storage systems that are not what you'd think of as conventional. Compressed air can store an awful lot of energy. So we're going to look at some of those systems, how practical or impractical they may be for personal use, and we're going to see how they're applied in the real world as well. But I really, really like the energy storage for, capacitors and batteries. We're reaching a stage where the storage of electrical energy is going to be pivotal to how we live. And I've mentioned this before. We can generate all sorts of power from the environment around us, sunlight, wind, movement of waves. And getting that energy isn't difficult. In fact, right now, it's actually cheaper than petroleum in many cases. But what do you do with it once you've got it? You have to have a place to put it. So if somebody says, hey, I'm going to give you 30 pounds of red-hot coal and all you've got your hands to carry it, you're not going to be able to do it. I should say we are in that situation when we generate a lot of energy from the sun or from the wind or any other source that we have. Without a means of storing it, we're really up the creek. And there are even chemical systems for storing energy that can be quite practical. Fuel cells use chemical energy. And we'll look at hydrogen and fuel cells and other things as well during the show. So if during the course of the show you have any questions or comments, you know where to send them. Eliza, tell our listeners where to send their questions or comments, please.
Send your questions or comments to admin, @talkuniverse.org.
That's right. You can also contact us through our Facebook page and leave messages there, and we'll grab them on the air and use the daylights out of them. So consider the following. You have gone out and invested in a large number of solar panels for your house. You have all this sunlight coming from the sky for free, and it's generating power for you. And maybe you might even have a windmill. After all, the sun doesn't shine at night, and you need something to run the systems when the sun isn't shining. So you might even have a backup generator. So you have the sun and the wind generating power for you. And what do you do with it? Well, normally you have what's known as a charge inverter system or a charge management system. And the charge management system actually takes the power and converts it to a voltage that'll charge a battery bank. And as you're consuming power, it takes that voltage from the battery bank or from whatever's generating it and converts it to 120 volt AC or whatever the normal is in your country. And so that's the inverter portion. Now you buy a single module, a charge controller inverter unit that does all of those things. And at one end, you put all your sources, whether they're your solar or your wind or whatever. And at the other end, you put a battery bank that stores that energy. And then in the middle is the load, your house, all the devices that you want to run. So you can see that solar panels aren't terribly expensive. Many of them running at less than $1 a watt these days. The windmills are still a little pricey, but they still can produce a lot of energy when the sun isn't shining, and that is an advantage. Your charge controller generally will run you a couple of $1,000s or so, the charge controller inverter system, but it manages everything for you, and it does it automatically, and you just buy it out of the box, and that's a great advantage. But those batteries, man, batteries are not cheap, and they have a number of issues, and one of them is limited lifespan. Now, batteries usually will be good for between 2 to 5 years. Changes in the technology have made them better, and they can last you probably 7 or 8 years in many cases now with proper management. But batteries are expensive, and lead-acid batteries have heavy metals that are toxic and acids in them. Typically, there's, sulfuric acid. The new lithium-ion batteries are very expensive, and some are not fully rechargeable. They're primary cells only. You certainly don't want that for storage because you can't recharge a primary cell. If you have something like the polymer batteries, some of them are pretty good. Some people used to use NiCads, nickel-cadmium batteries. Those are pretty much in the past for most things these days. So here's the issue. Chemistry is at the heart of all battery technology because we can take one molecule and use it to react with a metal or something and move electrons in it. And that chemistry provides the power that you use. But once you want to store that energy again, you have to reverse the voltage on that battery and charge it back up. You literally reverse the chemical reaction that produced the power in the first place. So batteries are chemical storage, and chemistry has issues. One of them is typically when you charge a battery, many of them vent hydrogen gas. So you can't leave them in an enclosed space or a closet, because the first time you open the door and you scuffed the rug and had a spark from your fingertip, you could have a colossal explosion. Battery storage facilities typically have to have good ventilation and ground straps to prevent static sparks from being an issue. These are some of the considerations for batteries. I know that when I was managing a very large bank of storage batteries, I would take a rubber mallet with me, and on a periodic basis, every 2 or 3 days, I would gently tap the sides of the batteries to make the bubbles that form inside them rise up to the top, because a bubble on an electrode creates a tiny spot where you can't conduct electricity. And if you go to charge the battery, it doesn't recharge the spot where the bubble is, and eventually this leads to failures. It gives you a non-uniform charge over the cell inside your battery. So there are things you have to do to maintain them properly. Ventilation, controlling the temperature range, bopping the side with a rubber mallet every now and then just to get the battery's bubbles to rise to the surface. So yes, batteries are great, but they have their limits, and knowing what those limits are essential if you're running your own personal utility system, an off-grid power system. So for the most part, people will generate and store electrical energy. However, we also know of devices called fuel cells. Now, a fuel cell is a pretty simple device. When we look at generating electricity, we often think of having a generator, one of those little devices with a motor similar to a lawnmower, and it's got a generator head inside it. And you put some gasoline or some diesel fuel in it, and it generates electricity directly. And literally 65% or more of the energy in your fuel is lost. But some fraction of it, typically 30 to 35%, ends up being useful electricity, which you can put in your system. When you look at that, the generator is not terribly efficient, but it gives you the advantage of being able to do it on demand at any time, and it's limited only by the amount or type of fuel that you have. A fuel cell is a radical step forward because a fuel cell has no moving parts, so it doesn't make any noise, typically can be fairly small, portable in most cases. You supply it with a fuel that reacts cleanly inside it, such as hydrogen or methyl alcohol, and it generates, in the case of hydrogen, water vapor is the exhaust. In the case of methanol, it's a little CO2 and water vapor, and electricity comes out. Now, it doesn't get any better than that. The problem is that fuel cells typically require, how shall I put this, expensive catalytic metals to make them work. They consist of a very thin membrane, and in most cases, a hydrogen atom or a proton will migrate through that membrane, and its exchange will move a current. So it is a device that uses a heat similar to combustion. It's not a flame, but heat inside the cell from the chemical reaction to produce your electricity and some sort of an exhaust. And it's generally very benign. Fuel cells have been made small enough to power things like laptops for days on a single charge. What an advantage that is, particularly if you're in a rough environment or don't have access to power. They have a lot of advantages, but they tend to be somewhat delicate as well. Recent advances in fuel cells have removed a lot of the catalytic metals such as platinum. They're normally required, and new types of fuel cells can work with such things as I mentioned, methanol and hydrogen easily enough. Methanol fuel cells generally have a small ampule, similar to a little perfume sample, that has a mixture of 50% methanol and 50% water, which is the fuel for the device. And so they're very easy to carry around. Compact ones, as I mentioned, for laptops have been available now for a few years. They also have them for cell phones and other small devices in some cases. So larger systems do exist for the home, but they're quite expensive. Normally they're used in specialty applications, but they're seeing a broader reach in the civilian population at this time, which is a very positive thing. The only downside is the cost of the fuel can be rather high. Pure methanol in distilled water 50/50 is not a cheap fuel, but it certainly does the job, and it can be stored for literally centuries in a glass jar without any issues. So at this point, there are alternatives to standard generators. Now, we have I'd say an interview, but it isn't. Our other co-host, Ed Minchow, will be joining us very shortly here. And Eliza, I want you to tell us about the upcoming break and what's going to happen.
Our co-host, Ed Minchow, will be joining us after the break.
Absolutely correct. So let's see what we can do about getting our ducks in a row here. We've got a number of issues. We're going to combine the Singularity Watch with Ed's chat with us. Now, one issue I just realized is I didn't do any training for Eliza's speech recognition for Ed's voice. And even though we have similar voices, it might not work, and I hadn't even thought of this until recently, but we'll fix it. We'll take care of it. And Eliza,
what can I do for you?
If you could, I'd like you to announce the break, please.
I'm Eliza. This is Talk Universe, and we will return after the break. There are more interesting things to hear in a few minutes.
Absolutely. So stay here and get your questions ready. From our studios in the beautiful tropical volcanic island of Montserrat, out in the West Indies, the Caribbean, we're talking about energy storage systems. I'm your host, Sir Charles Schultz, and thanks for listening to Talk Universe. Well, we're back from our break, and Ed Minchow is joining us in the studio for our interview. And Eliza, if you could welcome Ed to the show, please.
Hello, Ed, and welcome to the show.
Okay.
Hi. How are you doing?
Doing great. All right. So you've done a lot of research on energy systems and storage systems. And what's the first thing that comes to mind to you when somebody says energy storage?
Batteries.
Okay. And why?
Well, that's ubiquitous. Everybody uses batteries. Everybody has them in their car. They have in their flashlights. We're very used to, that keeps on going, that annoying rabbit with the drum. It's just the first thing that pops to mind for most people regarding energy storage.
Sure. Everything we do is basically electrical in nature. And so for the most part, when we talk about alternative energy storage, a lot of times people assume electricity. But we know there's other sorts of storage as well, like hydrogen and other types of fuels.
Yeah, there are about a dozen different types of energy storage that are in industrial use today, and more that are coming online over the next few years that are still in the R&D phase right now, but they're getting better, of course.
And so I think that the big issue is, number one, is it something I can afford? And number two, what form is that energy stored in? Can I get it back easily? I know that a lot of people talked about compressed air as a storage system a while back, and we did some things with that briefly.
Yeah, well, compressed air has been used as energy storage for nearly 100 years. When they're doing coal mining, the locomotives that bring the coal to the surface, starting in about 1928, they used compressed air to run that so that they wouldn't be burning anything underground in amongst all that coal dust, which is highly explosive. You don't want fires down there.
Well, you also don't want to suffocate your workers down in the tunnels.
Yeah, that's kind of a high priority. But yeah, they've been using compressed air trains from about 1928 till about 1970 or so. They used compressed air as a way to bring the locomotives down and then back up to the surface fully laden with coal.
Well, I know a lot of people have kind of experimented with compressed air for home energy storage, and in some cases they use systems similar to scuba tanks. But the real limits are when the air comes out, it generally will run like some sort of a spinner or a turbine generator to make your electricity. And so while it does work, you have to have an awful lot of tanks, and you have to have them on some sort of a valve tree. Now the plus side is if you have small tanks, you can regulate your pressure pretty evenly with very little effort. And if you have just one large tank, when that tank's gone, you don't have much of a warning. It's going down, and you don't have a backup, so to speak.
Yeah, it decreases in pressure pretty linearly, actually, as you use it. And at some point, the pressure drops so low that it's just not usable anymore. Right. You're counting on the pressure differential between the pressure inside the tank and the exterior atmospheric pressure. So, of course, when you get down to 14.7 pounds per square inch, or 101 kilopascals, however you prefer, it's not usable at all anymore.
Sure, and I know a regulator can do away with a lot of that, but if it isn't the biggest issue with compressed air as a storage system for your home, the fact that the tanks can rupture and that you have to have a significant amount of area in a controlled sort of a setting where they don't get exposed to the weather, so they don't rust or corrode. And it ends up being fairly, even if it were very useful, it ends up being fairly expensive to do for the individual.
Well, this is a common issue for all energy storage techniques, is when you're storing energy, that the density of the energy also means that the containment vessel, whether it's a battery, whether it's compressed air, or whether it's one of the other methods that we'll be talking about later, it's always an issue. Entropy increases. Of course, things break down. And, if you get a micro fissure on your compressed air storage tank, in this case, over time, that will eventually rupture. And it can rupture slowly, gracefully, and your system just doesn't work as well as it did last year. Or it can rupture all at once, and then you've got shrapnel.
Right. And another thing that a lot of companies used to use in the past for storage, kinetic methods. And I don't mean like springs, or weights hanging on ropes, which, in a pinch that would work. But the big flywheels used in steel mills, taconite mills, and even here on the island, the old sugar mills, they had big flywheels to even out the power from the steam engines. Any notes about flywheels for storage?
Well, let's see. We're looking for flywheel storage. You're looking at about 100 to 130 watt hours per kilogram of flywheel. Now, these flywheels can be very massive. The ones that they use in the tokamak reactors in Europe, some of them are 775 tons, operating at 225 RPMs. That is a lot of rotational inertia. At that speed with these large steel flywheels, like the limiting factor for any flywheel is the tensile strength of the material.
The speed at which it blows apart because it's spinning too fast.
The centripetal acceleration will tend to make the microcrystalline structure of, let's say you're using aircraft grade steel. It's really strong, but when you exceed its capabilities, it again forms microfissures which can spread, and you get, if you get chunks of your flywheel coming off into the assembly that houses the flywheel, that can rub against the sides of the flywheel. It can cause catastrophic breakdown. Of course, the central shaft of a flywheel, it's all spinning around a central axis. That thing has to be incredibly strong. If that breaks, your whole flywheel can take off.
There's something that you said right at the beginning of this that really struck me, and a lot of people wouldn't recognize this, that you're saying that in advanced nuclear fusion research, they're using mechanical flywheels from the 17th, 16th century, that sort of technology, to store the energy in this reactor.
Well, what they're doing it for is they need to be able to generate huge electrical currents for their electromagnets, and they need to be able to produce that very quickly. And flywheels are very good for delivering a huge amount of energy in a very short amount of time.
Like a hammer blow. They generate a huge pulse of current fantastically quickly.
Yeah, and that's what you need with a tokamak reactor.
Yes.
Just to get your electromagnets all charged at the same time, or within milliseconds, really.
So really, a flywheel can serve almost as not just storage, but transformative. It allows you to go from this potential or kinetic energy, this angular momentum energy, the spin, to an incredible amount of electrical power in a very, very short period of time, which isn't necessarily what somebody running a home would need. No,
it's industrial applications are generally what you're using those huge flywheels for. But I mean, there are small flywheels that will even out the energy produced in another storage method. Like if you look at a wristwatch, the energy is stored in a coiled spring, but there are flywheels inside the wristwatch to make sure that energy is coming out at a steady rate, rather than the spring unwinding all at once, and then you have to rewind your watch again in another 2 minutes or whatever.
So the flywheel in the watch is going back and forth. It's oscillating back and forth, and it's taking like a little tiny sip of the energy each time, just a little bit, and regulating its flow. Yes. Well, that makes perfect sense. I know a lot of people are interested in fuel cell technology, and in one of the places we worked, they had a hydrogen generator. Now, they didn't use it to generate electricity. They used it to fuel vehicles. But they also they had other methods as well. They had the solar power collectors, the photovoltaics. They had wind generators generating power. But all of it went through a charge controller and into a battery storage system.
Right. Those were marine deep cycle batteries. They can be charged and discharged many, many times. They can hold a lot of electricity. I believe that particular place had 50 of those marine deep cycle batteries.
It had an entire room devoted to them, yeah.
Yeah, and from that they were able to charge those batteries up during the day when the sunlight was hitting all of their solar panels and their wind turbines and stuff, and then at night you could still have electricity because it was all stored during the day.
Okay, and yeah, traditional battery system, but a big one. Now, you had a number of things you found online, different types of storage technology, and please dive in. Tell us what you found.
Okay, well, everything that we do with energy storage, all we're doing is converting energy from one form to another. Like we said with the tokamak reactors, they're converting rotational energy into electromagnetic energy. And it's what it's all about as far as energy storage goes. When you're converting, when you say you charge up your Tesla automobile, you're converting electrical energy that was produced originally. It was coal or nuclear energy that's gone down the transmission lines, stored in your battery, and then you're converting that into momentum in your car. It's all converting from one form to another. And when we were talking about, you briefly mentioned weights on a string. That's something people might recognize as the way a cuckoo clock operates. You'll lift up a weight,
Sure,
and as it slowly drops over the day.
The artistic metal pine cones.
The artistic metal pine cones. But that same idea is still being used on a larger scale. I am not sure about the status of this particular technology, whether it's actually in production use right now or simply just been proposed, but they're talking about taking concrete blocks on steel cables on a barge out in the deep ocean, and over the course of the day use whatever electrical power generation method you want to raise those concrete blocks up to the surface, and then as you need the energy, you're dropping those concrete blocks back down. And if you're dropping it 4 kilometers deep into the Atlantic, you can store something like, I believe the value they were saying was 400 megawatts per kilogram.
Wow. Now, that's a huge amount of energy.
That's a huge amount of energy.
Well, you'd think that there'd be more systems that people have on the ground where they have, let's say, a vertical tower with a huge block of anything heavy or massive, steel, concrete, whatever, and use it as a storage, and as it rolls down, it runs a generator or something.
Well, typically, the weight that they're using is water. That's 99% of all the stored energy in the world today is
hydropower,
in the form of hydropower. Sure. And quite often, a hydroelectric dam will not just simply be relying on Mother Nature to fill the top of the dam. They can produce power in other ways, like with windmills or solar or whatever, and use that to pump water from a lower reservoir to an upper reservoir. And then as you need the energy, you're just letting that water run back down through a turbine into your lower reservoir.
So they're using an alternative energy form or some other form to fill their battery, to fill their tank of water.
Right.
And then when it runs out, they turn it back into electrical power.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest problems with things like solar power and wind power is its intermittent nature. And in order to provide baseload power, you have to have a constant supply, which is why, unfortunately, so many wind power and solar power installations actually have natural gas generator backups. With using water as your storage medium, you're able to raise the water up to a high level and use it as on a continuous basis. It's sort of like a buffer, really.
Well, certainly, that makes great sense. I know that they often used springs as kinetic storage for some systems. And, in some cases, they even a load of something they're moving, like in an elevator, they actually have countermasses that weigh as much or more than what they're moving to minimize the amount of energy consumed to use the elevator. Yeah,
an elevator on the ground floor is really an energy storage device, because if your elevator's on the ground floor, your counterweight is at the top floor.
Sure. Okay, well, let's hold it right there. We're going to go for a break, and we'll be back very shortly. This is Sir Charles Schultz and Ed Minchow on Talk Universe. And by the way, be sure to send us your questions and comments, and we'll use them on the air. We've got a few right now, which we'll be getting to shortly. And we're going to combine our Singularity Watch with our upcoming material here in just a few minutes. So stay tuned. Welcome back to Talk Universe. We're continuing our chat with Ed Minchow on energy storage technologies. I do want to take a couple of listener questions before we proceed, though. Eliza, could you read the first question in the queue, please, for me?
Dorothy from Columbia says, I have solar panels on my house and would like to head toward getting off the grid, so I need a storage system. I am interested.
So, Ed, what do you think? What's your best recommendation?
For right now, for the best commercially available technology, I would go with marine deep cycle batteries. They can discharge almost completely. You can charge them up again pretty much indefinitely. They can be charged, I believe, on the order of hundreds of thousands of times before they lose their ability to hold a charge. And until something better comes along, which we'll be talking about a little bit later, that's probably the best bet for now.
That's good advice, and that's probably what I would do. As a matter of fact, I'm looking at some storage batteries myself right now. So you have a number of new technology things to discuss. Fire away, buddy.
Okay, well, let's see. For storing power, there's two main applications for storing power. One is stationary, the grid, and the other one is mobile, electric cars. You obviously cannot be using a hydroelectric dam, carrying it around in your car with you. You have to have something else, and companies like Tesla have been working on things like lithium-ion batteries and so forth. But really, I think the future of the mobile power storage probably lies with ultracapacitors.
Right.
And they're like regular capacitors. You've got two materials that are hold charge held apart by a dielectric which resists the flow of charge. And but the ultracapacitors have a much higher power density available to them. And the one company that I have seen mentioned most often with regards to ultracapacitors is called eStore. They're working in partnership with Zen, which is an electric car manufacturer in Canada. It's pretty much the typical inventor story. You got a guy who's got a great idea, who plugs away at it and plugs away at it. I think he's been going at it for about 15 years, this Richard Weir out of Cedar Park, Texas. And he runs into the kinds of obstacles that plague a lot of inventors. Whenever you come up with something new, people want to have they don't want to just see the theory behind it. They want to see it tested and tested and tested and tested 9 different ways from Sunday. So they're into their 5th phase of testing right now. With these eStore batteries, ultracapacitors rather, they are solid state. So your car battery, you've got sulfuric acid in there as your electrolyte.
One or the other.
Yeah, and that's, that sort of stuff can, when it heats up, it can expand and it can rupture your battery. And you might have noticed on the battery terminals in vehicles, you'll see a little like a blue foam that forms around the battery terminal.
Right. Yeah.
That's sulfuric acid actually eating away at the copper on the outside of the terminals.
Right. And it's making copper sulfate out of it.
Yeah, and with these ultracapacitors, since they're solid state, you avoid a lot of those problems, and they're able to get much, much higher energy density. They were talking about 280 watt hours per kilogram.
Well, that's pretty significant.
That is pretty. It's double, at least double what you would get with a lead acid battery.
Right. Well, here's the other issue, and that's this: batteries are very dense.
Yeah.
Lead acid batteries, lead's dense stuff.
Yeah.
And so, and this material is barium titanate, correct?
Barium titanate. Yeah.
And so, even though barium's pretty dense, I would imagine that these capacitors, not having all the lead and the acids in it, will be very, very stable and probably much lighter weight. So they may be a little larger than a standard car battery because the density is likely to be a lot lower, in my estimation. What do you think?
Well, it's really hard to say at this point. I mean, like I haven't seen any commercially available units from eStore yet. And really, they're just still in the process of proving that this actually works. And they've done 1 million cycles on some of theirs. They've got an outside lab working on verifying that it can work many, many times. I think they're up to 500,000 cycles so far, and still in the process.
Well, that is significant. And most lead-acid batteries generally won't go that many cycles, fully charge, discharge. They have a real limit to their swing.
They do, and they have another limitation in that a lead-acid battery pretty much has to operate when it's about 85% charged. Much below that, and it really won't.
It doesn't recover.
It doesn't really recover, and much above that, and you're storing. It's wasting. These solid state ultracapacitors go from 100% down to 0, and then back up.
Because it's not a chemical process.
Because it's not a chemical.
There's no transformation occurring inside the material. The material remains the same.
Right.
It's just electrons being placed here or there. And here's another thought. And what strikes me about ultracapacitors is because they have no toxins, explosives, corrosives, no liquids, they are aerospace worthy in most cases with very, very little variation in their design. You can't take a lead-acid battery in an airplane and expect it to go loop-to-loop and the batteries still perform properly without leakage in many cases, unless it's specifically designed for those applications. Bubbles in the battery are bound to exist, and it's going to change your charging. With a solid-state device like an ultracapacitor, you don't have that issue.
Because there's no chemical changes occurring.
Right.
And, you know, when you're talking about space applications, ideally you don't want corrosive materials in your nanosatellite.
Sure.
You want something that can store up charge and maybe discharge it when if you're using an electrical propulsion system, for instance. You want to be able to store up charge with your solar panels and then discharge it very quickly through your
engine or whatever.
Yeah, like a Teflon engine where it vaporizes Teflon. You need a very high voltage to do that, and you got to do it over and over and over and over again. Sure. And you really don't want a chemical reaction responsible for storing your energy. You'd much prefer to have something solid state.
Right. Well, here's another thought. I've noticed that supercapacitors and ultracapacitors typically have voltages around 2.5 to 2.7 volts. That's pretty much the limit, and they die. So, there's a pretty standard strategy for getting around that and turning it into something better. What do they normally do?
Well, they can use a solid-state transformer. For one thing, you can, by switching back and forth the poles electrically, you can actually build up a significant charge, a significant voltage. Now, these guys at EE Store and Zen, they're actually stacking these things, and I believe they're getting up to 3,000 volts.
Yeah, now that's
low current.
Okay, true. And even in a car battery, in an automobile battery, you typically have 6 cells because each cell is rated at about 2 volts.
Right.
So if you stacked up 5 ultracapacitors, you'd be right in the ballpark.
Yeah, you can stack them. You can link them together in a chain.
Sure.
It kind of opens up all sorts of applications when you have a mobile device that can store energy density comparable to gasoline.
So yeah, it also means drones get a lot more range because these things are fairly lightweight. Right.
Laptop computers, like they're a direct competitor to the lithium batteries that you find in your laptops and cell phones.
Well, here's the other question. What's your other technology you had in mind? This sounds great, and I'm looking forward to it.
This one is for baseload power, and it's a liquid metal battery. Normally with batteries and storage systems, you want them operating about room temperature. If they get hot, they don't work as well.
Sure.
With the liquid metal battery, the minimum operating temperature of such a battery is 650 degrees Celsius. In order to make they're made out of magnesium is the anode, I believe, and then antimony is the cathode. Or I could have switched it around, but the 650 Celsius to melt magnesium and 630 Celsius to melt antimony and the dielectric in between them is a molten salt. And if you're taking alternative energy from windmills or solar power stations, and because it's intermittent, if the wind drops suddenly and you lose 10 megawatts from your source into your grid, the grid has to respond within milliseconds.
Sure.
And a coal-fired plant or a natural gas plant can't respond that quickly.
Right. No, they can't get a burner running and a generator up to speed that short period of time.
They can get it up and running within a minute, but if you need response within milliseconds, you need batteries. And the best way, I believe this is the best way, these liquid metal batteries. This has been proposed by a guy named Donald Solway at MIT, along with his, at the time, grad student, David Bradwell. And they started testing these liquid metal batteries with a 1-inch diameter cell that could hold 1 watt-hour. Mm-hmm. And then they went to a puck-sized one that was like, I believe, 10 watt-hours, and then a slightly larger one, about 6 inches across, that was 20 watt-hours, and then a pizza-sized one that was 2 kilowatt-hours, I believe. It's scaling. It scales very, very well. They formed a company to keep research on this going called LMBC, and that company has since changed names to Ambri.com, A-M-B-R-I. I think this is probably the future of storing baseload power for alternate energy. It allows energy companies to incorporate wind and solar and tidal energy into the grid seamlessly, and be able to store all that energy when they're producing it, and be able to store it like overnight or whatever, so that you can still be using solar power at night.
But it's been saved offline somewhere.
Yeah, right. And the unique thing about these batteries, besides operating at these temperatures, the hotter they get, the better they work, the more energy they're able to store, because the magnesium ions can flow through that salt fixture more easily. And it's really does look like it's going to be the future of energy storage for baseload power, which is really what you need when you're dealing with ground-based power on a large industrial scale.
Right.
Not only do you have to match the impedance, match the power going out of the circuit with the power coming into the circuit, and be able to handle those fluctuations that invariably occur, you're also able to store much more energy per unit mass, let's say. Instead of having like a bank of marine cycle batteries, there would be one big, hot, heavy liquid metal battery.
Well, okay, that sounds fascinating, and I hope that they reach a point where it becomes economically feasible and they get out on in the market. There have been bridge units before, of course.
Yeah, Donald Solway, the quote that really stuck out when I listened to his TED Talk was, "If you want to make something dirt cheap, make it out of dirt." And it helps if your dirt contains magnesium and antimony, but those aren't the only possible ones. It just happens to be that those are readily available worldwide. They're relatively cheap.
Yeah.
And so he started with the idea of making it cheap first before he even looked at the chemistry involved, and then went after the chemistry to ensure that it stayed cheap.
Great idea.
Yeah.
No, that's the way a lot of things should be designed. I think we missed that a lot. Mm-hmm. Well, we're going to go for another break now, and these are interesting technologies, and wow, there's a lot to be said about it. Eliza, could you read the next question from our listeners, please?
April says many people store solar energy from panels on car batteries in Hawaii. Wish the panels and equipment was cheaper on the East Coast.
Well, I'll tell you one thing. The solar panels have come down to under $1 a watt in many cases. You can find them online, so you're not really restricted to a single coast, fortunately, these days. So there's hope. They can be much cheaper. This is Talk Universe, and we'll be back right after the break. So we're looking forward to having Ed on the show a lot more and having him actually host the show a couple of times. And we'll see just how his particular style and presentation works with the audience. I think he's very good at it. And I'm looking forward to it because he's been a long-time friend and he's quite good with science and technology, and I think his presentation is great too. So now we're going to get down to the rest of our listener questions. And Eliza, if you could, please read the next question for me.
Dan from Jonesboro says using alternative energy to generate hydrogen, which can be used to generate energy when needed, is often discussed.
That's absolutely true. We have a lot of people who generate hydrogen gas by using alternative energy, and then they can store that hydrogen and use it later either in a fuel cell or in some cases as a vehicle fuel. We had a hydrogen generator in one of the places we were living and working that did precisely that. The issues that you do run into is how to safely store hydrogen in quantity. It is the fluffiest stuff in the universe, basically. It's the lightest element, and so it takes high-pressure storage to get any significant quantities of it. But it certainly shouldn't stop you. Storing hydrogen as a long-term fuel can be done, and it isn't that difficult. And one thing that you have in your corner is low-yield solar or thermal or whatever energy that you have from the environment can create a lot of hydrogen constantly, just like your grass is growing all the time. And when you need it, it's there in the tank. And so if you're running on fuel cells, it's a heck of a way to store energy for making electricity and actually clean hot water later. That's what they do on the space shuttle, or they did when it was in flight. So Eliza, how many questions do we have left in the queue, please?
I have a single final question for me to read.
Great. Why don't you read that for me?
Daryl from Orlando says barium titanate supercapacitors.
Oh, yes, exactly one of the subjects we were talking about. The barium titanate supercapacitors show a lot of capability. They're not yet manufacturing them, but they are testing them. And I've seen a few sites online for hobbyists to make barium titanate supercapacitors themselves. One of the fellows was using wax as the material to hold it and ended up using epoxy, and he has some interesting tips on tamping it into the mold with a stick and so forth. It's very simple, but it's possibly workable. I'm hoping that this is something that turns into a product we can really get our hands on in the near term, because we can certainly use supercapacitors and hypercapacitors or ultracapacitors, anything they can come up with that stores energy in that manner. It could easily displace a lot of batteries. So, Eliza, that was probably our last question, correct?
My queue is now empty, Charles.
Okay, very good. So we're done with the listener questions, and we're going to proceed from here. We really combined our Singularity Watch with the announcement of these new technologies tonight. In essence, we're just basically looking at how energy is stored. And at this present time, it's kind of sad to say, the best way to go if you have an off-grid system or you're trying to store your own alternative energy is to buy some deep cycle marine batteries or some variation of those and use them, because really the way it looks, it's going to be between 3 and 5 years, and I'd say no more than that, before we see a real shift in the technology. We expect new technologies to pop out right away, but just a few years back, we knew that the cycle was typically 30 to 50 years for a discovery to turn into a technology. Things move so rapidly today, we expect that to happen in 3 to 5 years. And that's an order of magnitude shortening of the time frame. Now, are we just impatient? Well, we have a lot of needs. And when you are needy, as our civilization is, you try to expedite things. You try to make it happen quickly. And I understand that. But there are a lot of people right now who can afford, finally, to get solar systems, solar panels and wind systems and backup generators and the charging units for them. But the batteries are the sticking point. The energy storage itself is always the sticking point. So, again, sad to say, your best bet today would probably be some good deep cycle marine batteries. After all, they're easily available, and they are a known technology, and they'll be around for a while. And they should last you for that 3 to 5 year period when the next big thing comes along. So, if you're going off grid, get those batteries. Now, for those of you who are adventurous, you might invest in a bank of fuel cells. And if you're using the methanol fuel cells, just be sure you have a good source of methanol available. And you have to be careful about the purity, because contaminating a fuel cell generally means destroying it. You have to be very careful with them. There are fuel cells that burn fuels other than hydrogen gas, and most of them tend to be touchy. They tend to be touchy. Most of the hydrogen fuel cells depended on platinum and other catalytic metals. They now have new materials that act as the barrier, the membrane, without the use of those expensive catalytic metals. So the prices have come down quite a bit on some of the fuel cells. If you're going to power your house on fuel cells, though, keep in mind that you have to have a tank system to store that fuel in, whether it's pressurized gas or whether it's your methanol solution. So get ready to add a room in your garage where your power system is, and you're going to have some materials that are flammable in there, one way or another. If you're going with the supercapacitors or the ultracapacitors, then you still need to have the equivalent of a closet somewhere that acts as a battery room to store all that energy. So this isn't something that comes free or cheap. There are always material costs. But in the long run, you're going to find that you won't spend anything on utilities once that system is set up. I mean, literally nothing. Now, I did actually hold back one item for the Singularity Watch because I thought it was so interesting. And so even though most of what we were talking about with Ed earlier was, in my estimation, a good Singularity Watch, I did hold one back. And so, Eliza, if you will, please announce the Singularity Watch for me.
Tonight's Singularity Watch on Talk Universe is next.
I would like to have you announce the Singularity Watch, please.
Okay, sir. Sir, I don't understand how to do that.
Why is that?
The Singularity Watch has already been done.
Okay. Well, I'll handle it. Thank you. So I always have a soft spot for nanotechnology, and this was published in Phys.org. And Eliza, please read the title.
Nanoscale logic machines go beyond binary computing.
Right. This is using single atoms to do computing processes. Now, this is a fascinating article. Here's the first line of it. Please read, Eliza.
Scientists have built tiny logic machines out of single atoms that operate completely differently than conventional logic devices do.
That's right. And what's fascinating about this is that they're using the noise that happens typically in atomic processes, which is normally a problem, but they're actually using it to physically model systems or simulate the problems, and the randomness becomes a feature in this case. So they're capable of producing a class of tiny analog computers that solve computationally difficult problems with statistical algorithms using nanoscale solid-state physical devices. So it was a team of researchers, Barbara Fresh et al., from universities in Belgium, Italy, Australia, Israel, and the U.S., and they published a paper on the new nanoscale logic machines in an issue of Nano Letters. Basically what this is a crystal of silicon, and they have, they basically doped it with specific atoms, and they used phosphorus atoms in this case, and they used quantum tunneling effects of electrons moving in and out of the dopant atom. So this is really interesting. Each atom can hold one or two of the electrons, and they can have different energy levels. So the atoms can occupy one of four possible states. So the atoms are constantly transitioning between these different states according to a set of probabilities. Well, they've been able to use this to compute. So this is a new class of nanoprocessor that isn't limited to binary alone. And what it means is the potential exists to make computing out of nanomaterials that actually will far exceed the initial capabilities that were estimated using traditional logic methods. Initial estimates that were made on nanoscale processors showed that if we used standard binary, it should be possible to pack a computer in a 1/2 micron cube, half a millionth of a meter on an edge, that would do 1 billion instructions per second. This could change that estimate upwards at least 4 times or more, depending on the structures necessary to program and then read the computation back. But in any case, nanoprocessors, when they do come around, should be incredibly powerful and in very, very tiny spaces. Because if you think about it, you actually could include many hundreds or thousands of processors in something much, much smaller than a grain of sand. So let's summarize what we've talked about tonight. Energy storage systems have made a lot of advances, and we see a great number of new materials and methods. Some of the oldest methods, kinetic storage, for instance, are being revived in some cases where they're using physical masses to store energy, such as those heavy masses of concrete being suspended on an ocean barge and then being run up and down. That's an old technology, but one that we could put to use. And we still use it all the time in the form of dams with water behind them. And, of course, the energy to fill the reservoir can be harvested from solar or wind or other alternative forms of energy. So this isn't something difficult. We really could build a number of systems that generate their own power from the environment and run unsupervised. And systems that would automatically fill the dams could be one of those systems that harvest energy from the environment to pump water into drought-stricken areas or to pump water out of flood areas would actually be something very wise. I've often been an advocate for some sort of universal countrywide drought and flood management system, and it isn't a new idea. It's something that's been kicking around for quite a while. But alternative energy sources give us the opportunity to do that at very little cost in energy. Basically becomes a computing and management problem at that point. Of course, there are environmental issues to consider as well, but we can deal with that. It just takes an understanding of what parts of the environment are in danger and how we can get around that. When it comes to alternative energy, it really is becoming more of the norm these days, and as stated previously, solar has actually come down to be cheaper than petroleum in some applications and in some locations. And I think this is a great trend because when we start seeing factories that produce their goods, their services and everything strictly powered by alternative energy, we're going to be reaching a point where we don't have to worry about petroleum so much. Now, we will never completely eliminate petroleum at the first estimation. If we didn't use petroleum at all, we'd have no feedstock for plastics or lubricants or industrial chemicals. So we're going to need those things. On the other hand, most of our power is not generated with petroleum, but with coal and other resources. So there's often a disparity between the power sources that we think we're using and the ones we're actually using. Most of the electricity to reach your home comes from either coal or nuclear or hydropower, and a lot of it has nothing whatsoever to do with petroleum. Petroleum really is for industry and transportation more than anything. So that's something very important to keep in mind. Now, solar panels have traditionally been made in factories that were run off grid power, with the costs decreasing the way they are, and with aggressive methods of recycling old solar panels, because they do lose efficiency over time. We could reach a state where we're using the sun to power the factories that make the panels that gather the sun to power the factories, and so on. This is a great place to be in, and this is a great time to be facing these changes. But again, storage systems are the big issue, and while we do see amazing promise for materials like graphene and barium titanate, we have yet to see a commercial product reach the market that takes advantage of this technology. And so for now, we're still using marine batteries and deep cycle batteries and a lot of lithium and polymers and lead and acid. But take heart that the fact is we are learning more and we're able to store more energy in a smaller area. And we're going to see some very clever tricks emerging in the next few weeks to months. I expect that we're going to see some real upsetting, game changers in the market very shortly, because as the materials become easier to understand and manufacture, as we understand what we should be doing with them, and as our, basic efforts to recycle things become better, we're going to find that a lot of the technologies we need to live very successfully and very well have been right under our noses all along. So, my closing line, make you the world a better or more beautiful place for having lived in it, still stands. I hope you've enjoyed the show tonight and learned something. This is Talk Universe. I'm Sir Charles Schultz. Please come back and listen again.